The knock came just after sunset, quick and firm, and Emily Carter felt it in her chest before she heard it clearly, because she already knew why someone would be at her door, and the thought made her stomach tighten as she stood in the middle of her small Portland apartment, surrounded by half-packed boxes and unpaid bills, the air smelling faintly of coffee gone cold, her phone silent with no job offers and no missed calls, just reminders she had ignored all day. And when the knock came again, she didn't jump, but she didn't breathe either, because late rent had a sound to it, a meaning she had learned too well over the years, and she took a moment to smooth her sweater, not because it mattered but because she needed something to do with her hands before opening the door, already rehearsing excuses she hated, already feeling smaller than she wanted to be, and when she finally turned the handle she expected a stranger, or anger, or at least disappointment, but instead she found Daniel Brooks standing there, her landlord, holding a folded envelope he didn't raise or wave, his posture calm, his face serious but not hard, and that alone confused her enough to forget her speech, because Daniel never knocked like this, never came in the evening, never showed up unannounced, and for a second neither of them spoke, the hallway light casting a soft shadow behind him, and he looked at her the way people do when they are worried but trying not to show it, which made her chest ache more than anger ever could. And she stepped aside without being asked, letting him in as the door closed with a quiet click that sounded too final, too loud in the small space, and Daniel glanced around, not judging, just noticing, his eyes resting briefly on the empty bookshelf, the stack of envelopes on the counter, the second chair missing from the table, and Emily felt exposed in a way she hadn't expected, as if her life had been laid out without her permission, and she started to speak too fast, apologizing, explaining, promising things she wasn't sure she could keep, but Daniel raised his hand slightly, not to stop her but to slow her down, and said her name in a steady voice that made her pause, and he told her to sit, so she did, perching on the edge of the chair while he remained standing, and the silence stretched but didn't feel sharp, more like a held breath, and he told her he hadn't come to threaten or warn her, that he had noticed the missed payment and then noticed she hadn't answered his email, and he said he just wanted to check on her, because people disappear sometimes and it doesn't always mean they don't care, and Emily felt heat rise behind her eyes, because no landlord had ever said something like that to her before, and she looked down at her hands, embarrassed by how much that simple concern touched her, and she admitted she'd lost her job, said it quickly like ripping off a bandage, adding that she was looking, that she wasn't lazy, that she hated being late, and Daniel listened without interrupting, without crossing his arms, without glancing at his watch, and when she finished there was no lecture, no warning about policy, just a slow nod as if he had already guessed, and he surprised her again by asking how she was holding up instead of when she could pay, and that question cracked something open in her, because she realized she hadn't let herself answer it honestly in weeks, and she said she was tired, more tired than she'd ever been. Tired of proving she deserved space in the world, tired of counting days and dollars, tired of feeling like every mistake erased years of effort, and Daniel's expression softened in a way that made her look away, because being seen like that felt dangerous, and he finally sat across from her, placing the envelope on the table but not pushing it toward her, and he told her he remembered what it was like to start over, that owning a building didn't mean life had always been stable, and for a brief moment his voice changed, just enough to hint at something heavy beneath it, and then he said the words she would replay later in her mind, that he wasn't there to collect the rent tonight, that money could wait, and Emily laughed once, sharp and nervous, sure she had misunderstood, but he didn't smile or take it back, and instead he explained that he cared more about knowing his tenants were safe than staying on schedule, that he believed pressure rarely fixed anything, and she stared at him, unsure what to do with that kindness, unsure what it cost. Because kindness often came with strings she couldn't see until it was too late, and she asked him what he wanted then, because there was always something, and Daniel hesitated, choosing his words carefully, saying he wanted honesty, communication, and maybe trust, nothing more than that, but the way he said it made the room feel different, charged with something quiet and unspoken, and Emily felt her pulse quicken. Not from fear but from the sudden awareness of him as more than a name on a lease, more than a figure of authority, and she didn't like that thought, didn't want it, because it complicated things, and she pushed her chair back slightly, creating space, telling herself to stay grounded, and Daniel noticed, respect clear in the way he leaned back as well, giving her room, and he told her she didn't owe him anything beyond what was fair and legal, that he just wanted her to know she wasn't alone in this moment. And as he stood to leave, the envelope still untouched, he paused at the door and said there was something else he wanted to say someday, not now, because timing mattered, and he didn't explain what he meant, didn't look back when he left, and when the door closed Emily sat there in the quiet, heart racing, mind spinning, unsure whether she had just been given relief or invited into something she wasn't ready to understand, knowing only that the knock she feared had changed the shape of her evening. And maybe more than that. Daniel returned 2 days later, not with a knock this time but with a quiet message asking if he could stop by, and Emily said yes before she could overthink it, because the silence since his last visit had been heavier than the fear she felt before opening the door, and when he arrived it was late afternoon, sunlight cutting across the living room floor, making everything feel exposed and honest, and he didn't bring papers or reminders, just himself, standing there with a careful smile that told her he was aware of how strange this all was. And they sat again at the small table, closer this time but not touching, and Daniel spoke first, saying he didn't want things to feel unclear or uncomfortable, that he believed adults deserved straight words, and Emily nodded, bracing herself, because clarity often came with endings, and he told her plainly that he still wasn't asking for rent, not yet, that he had reviewed his finances and could wait without risk, but more than that he wanted to explain why he had reacted the way he did. And he said that years ago, after his marriage ended, he had learned how quickly life could collapse when support disappeared, how shame could grow when people treated struggle like failure, and owning property hadn't erased that memory, it had sharpened it, because now he stood on the other side of the door, and Emily listened, surprised by his openness, by the way he spoke without drama, just truth, and she found herself answering him honestly too, telling him how losing her job had shaken her sense of worth, how every unanswered application felt personal, how she avoided friends because she didn't want pity, and Daniel didn't interrupt, just listened, his hands folded, his eyes steady, and when she finished he said softly that what he wanted from her wasn't payment or gratitude but communication, that silence worried him more than numbers, and then he said something that made her heart stumble, that over the months he'd noticed her, not in a way that crossed lines, but in small human ways, the way she carried groceries alone, the way she smiled politely but never lingered, the way she wrote late at night with her window light on, and Emily felt a flush of heat at being seen so clearly, unsure whether to feel flattered or exposed, and she told him that noticing didn't mean wanting, that she couldn't afford confusion, emotional or otherwise, and Daniel agreed immediately, saying that was why he hadn't said anything before, why he was careful now. Because he didn't want need to blur choice, and he said whatever existed between them would only matter if she stood on equal ground, able to say yes or no freely, and that respect settled something in her chest, easing a tension she hadn't named, and the conversation moved faster than, words flowing, questions answered, boundaries spoken aloud instead of guessed, and they talked about practical things too, timelines, expectations, a plan that allowed her dignity without pressure. And Daniel made it clear he would put everything in writing if she wanted, because trust didn't mean vagueness, and Emily laughed quietly at that, feeling lighter than she had in weeks, and when there was nothing left to explain, they sat in a comfortable pause, the kind that didn't demand filling, and Emily realized she wasn't afraid of him, not as a landlord, not as a man, but she was afraid of the feeling growing in her chest, a cautious warmth that came from being treated as capable and worthy at the same time. And Daniel seemed to sense the shift, because he stood, signaling. The meeting was over before it crossed into something unclear, and at the door he turned and said that whatever happened next would be slow and respectful, or it wouldn't happen at all, and that she should take time to decide what she wanted, not what she felt she owed, and after he left Emily leaned against the closed door, heart beating fast, mind sharp and awake, realizing that what Daniel wanted wasn't money, or control, or even closeness without care, but honesty in a world that often rushed past it, and as the sun faded and the room dimmed, she understood that clarity didn't always end things, sometimes it opened a door she hadn't known she was allowed to step through. The days after that conversation moved faster than Emily expected, not because life suddenly became easy but because something inside her had shifted, and she stopped hiding from the world as much as she had been, waking earlier, sending more applications, taking short walks just to remind herself she existed. Beyond worry, and Daniel didn't hover or check in too often, which she noticed and appreciated, because his distance felt intentional, respectful, and when they did cross paths it was natural. Brief talks in the hallway or on the steps outside the building, conversations that flowed without effort, about weather turning colder, about a coffee shop that had closed, about books they both liked without planning to, and slowly those small talks stretched longer, not because either pushed for it but because neither rushed to leave, and Emily felt the strange comfort of being around someone who didn't ask her to perform or explain herself, someone who let silence exist without trying to fix it. And one evening Daniel brought up writing after seeing her notebook under her arm, asking about it without pressure, and she told him she used to write stories, how it once felt like breathing but had faded when survival took over, and he listened like it mattered, like it wasn't a hobby to dismiss. And he encouraged her without praise that felt empty, just saying he hoped she would return to it when she was ready, and that stayed with her, because no one had spoken to her dreams like that in a long time, and as weeks passed the emotional space between them narrowed in ways that were subtle but real, shared smiles that lasted a beat longer, glances held just enough to notice, but always followed by restraint, and that restraint was what made the pull stronger, because it was chosen, and Emily became more aware of her own boundaries, how important they were, how fragile trust could be, and she tested the situation in her mind again and again, asking herself if she felt safe, if she felt free, and the answer surprised her by staying yes. And one night as rain fell again, mirroring the first evening they truly spoke, they found themselves sitting on the front steps, neither planning it, both just ending up there, talking about loneliness without calling it that, about how adulthood often felt quieter than expected, and Daniel admitted that after his divorce he had avoided closeness out of fear of imbalance, of needing more than he could give or taking more than he should, and Emily understood that fear deeply, because she had lived in it for months, and when their hands rested near each other on the step, not touching but close enough to feel warmth, she felt the tension rise, not urgent but steady, and she pulled back slightly, needing to hear something before going further, and she said quietly that she couldn't blur roles, that she needed to know. She was more than a tenant in a hard season, and Daniel answered without hesitation that she was, that whatever grew between them would only grow when she stood fully on her feet again, because anything else wouldn't feel right to him, and that answer settled the last of her doubts, even as it created a new ache, because patience can be harder than risk, and from that moment on the relationship found a rhythm built on intention, Daniel helping only when asked, Emily accepting only what didn't cost her dignity, both of them holding space for something unspoken but alive. And when Emily finally landed a short-term contract, the relief was sharp and emotional, and Daniel was the first person she told, not because he had to know but because she wanted him to, and he celebrated quietly, sincerely, without making it about himself. And that night as they stood again in the hallway, the air thick with possibility, their hands brushed by accident, and this time neither pulled away immediately, but they also didn't step closer, because both understood that desire wasn't something to rush. And Emily realized then that attraction didn't have to be dramatic to be powerful, that longing could exist alongside respect, and that heartbreak didn't always come from wanting, sometimes it came from choosing to wait. And as Daniel wished her good night, his voice warm but controlled, Emily felt both comforted and restless, aware that something meaningful was unfolding slowly, carefully, and that the hardest part wasn't avoiding a mistake, but trusting that something good could grow without forcing it. And as she closed her door and leaned against it, heart steady but full, she understood that part 3 of their story wasn't about crossing a line, but about learning where the line truly was, and choosing, again and again, to honor it. The final shift came quietly, without drama, on a clear morning when Emily woke before her alarm and realized she wasn't anxious for the first time in months, because life, while still imperfect, finally felt steady enough to hold, and she moved through the day with purpose, finishing her contract work, answering emails, making plans instead of excuses. And when her first full paycheck cleared, she didn't celebrate loudly or tell many people, she simply sat at her table, wrote out a check with calm hands, and felt something close to pride, not because she had struggled, but because she had endured without losing herself. And that evening she went upstairs to Daniel's door instead of waiting for him to come to hers, feeling the weight of choice in every step. And when he opened the door he looked surprised but pleased, stepping aside without hesitation, and she handed him the envelope, explaining she wanted to pay what she owed, not because he asked, but because she was ready, and Daniel looked at the check but didn't take it immediately, instead looking at her with a quiet respect that told her this moment mattered to him too, and he said he was proud of her, not in a way that sounded like authority, but in a way that sounded like belief, and when he finally accepted the payment, it felt less like a transaction and more like a closing chapter, and they talked openly then, without caution or guarded words, about what had passed between them and what still lingered, acknowledging the careful distance they had kept, the feelings they hadn't fed but hadn't denied either, and Emily told him she felt strong now, not desperate, not afraid, and that if they chose anything beyond this moment, it would be because she wanted it, not because she needed shelter or mercy, and Daniel listened closely, nodding, agreeing that timing had been everything, that waiting had protected something fragile, and as they sat together on his small balcony watching the lights come on across the city, the air calm and open, there was no rush to define what they were becoming, only an understanding that mutual respect had laid a foundation stronger than attraction alone, and Daniel admitted that he hadn't expected kindness to lead him here, that offering patience had changed him too, reminding him that care didn't always need to be loud to be meaningful, and Emily shared that being treated fairly had restored her trust in herself, that someone believing in her before she could had made the difference, and when the night grew cooler and the conversation slowed, they stood, facing each other with an honesty that felt earned, and there was a pause, full but gentle, where either could step back or forward. And Emily realized she wasn't afraid of the future anymore, not because it was certain, but because she knew she could walk into it on her own terms, and when she reached for Daniel's hand it wasn't out of need, but choice, and he met it with equal care, neither pulling nor pressing, just holding, and that simple connection felt deeper than anything rushed ever could, and in that moment Emily understood that the story that began with late rent wasn't about rescue or imbalance, but about two people meeting each other honestly in a hard season and refusing to take advantage of it, and as she returned to her apartment later that night, the city quiet and familiar, she looked around the space that had once felt temporary and saw possibility instead, knowing that whatever came next would be built slowly, respectfully, and freely, and that love, when it was right, didn't ask for payment, it waited until both people were ready to give.